it's an understatement to say that this year has been very eventful, not only in Ukraine, but across the world. So now the question which we have is Ukraine's foreign policy in lockdown. And my name is Katarina Wolczuk, and I'm Associate Fellow, Russia and Eurasia Program, Chatham House, and also Professor of East European Politics at the University of Birmingham. We are very lucky, fortunate to have three speakers today who are exceedingly well positioned to answer the questions we have listed in the program, but also provide, perhaps elaborate on new emerging issues, like, for example, the latest developments around Mr. Kolomoisky. And the speakers today they will be speaking in this order. Mr. Vasyl Bodnar, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Alyona Hetmanchuk, Director of the New Europe Center in Kyiv, and Konstantin Yelisseyev, former ambassador to the EU, Deputy Head of the Presidential Administration between 2015 and 19, and the head of the NGO in Ukraine, New Solutions Center. So we will be allowing the speakers to speak for about 7-8 minutes maximum. We have the full room, if I can put it this way. At the last count, there were about 150 people registered. So we will be, please feel free to post questions via the chat function. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you will see the chat function, and you can send your questions to the audience in general, or to specific, or perhaps comments to specific people. And however, if you are eager to ask questions in person, there will be an opportunity. Again, if you look under the participants, you will see a list of participants, and you will be able to press the raise hand button, which is a blue little button. Please use that function, because with so many participants, we are not able to see all the hands which are physically raised. So those are the rules. We will keep you muted. I do apologize, we would have a lot of sort of noise in the background. You will be unmuted, however, when you ask the questions. So we are starting our presentations, and let's start, as promised, with Vasyl Bodnar. And we would particularly perhaps like you to focus on the questions of the successes of the first presidential year in office, insofar as foreign policy is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today to you and to deliver a couple of messages with regard to the foreign policy of President Zelensky. So this year was not so easy as it might be, but nevertheless, I guess we survived, and we have done a lot of positive things, which for the new team and for the new political leadership is actually the achievements. So first of all, the basics of foreign policy of Ukraine had not been changed, despite of any rumors and despite of any expectations. I have an opportunity to participate in one of the international events at the beginning of the career of President Zelensky, when there were overestimated expectations that President Zelensky should do something, that and this, and the only one side that should do it was Ukraine. But it was not so. So we construct the policy in such a manner that we should defend our national interests, but try to change tactics aimed at achievement of specific results, in particular in defending territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. So if to talk about the basic steps which have been done, it's the Minsk process and Normandy format. Actually, it was the move forward, and there were different attempts to find a common ground and to move forward with the settlement process. So there was a re-establishment of the persons there, and there is high-ranking officials are present there. So it means that the state pays specific attention to this process and do its best, not only to speak about the defense, but also to do something. There was also the things which brings to the when the personal through the personal involvement of President Zelensky, many Ukrainian detainees and hostages which have been held in Russia for the long period of time and the occupied territories have been freed. And it's one of the personal things which also touched the people and also showed the concrete steps which have been done that period. So also the normal format have been re-established, and the Paris meeting also have been conducted, and the basic developments and the basics of Ukrainian foreign policy was defended there in this meeting, and we try to do our best also to fulfill the commitments, but also push hard on the international community also to stress the necessity of Russia to fulfill their commitment, and all our endeavors could be estimated as successful in case you see how Russians reacted on the foreign policy of President Zelensky through their statements and estimations of foreign policy. So even it was called that there is a continuity of the foreign policy with regard to the conflict settlement. There is also a new format and new ideas in the trilateral contact group, and also the recent developments show that strong stance of Ukrainian side with regard to our national interests will be preserved, and we will strongly insist on implementing the Minsk agreements only how we will look at that the border issue, the presence of international Red Cross, entrance to the hostages and to the prisoners, etc. So it's remain our key priorities. As well, the international dimension. So keeping the issue of Russian-Ukrainian international conflict within the international organizations and among our partners, it's remained the same priority, and the sanctions policy, OSCE, UN, and other international organizations, we still continue to defend and to even win some small battles with Russians, and try to do our best as well with regard to the international criminal court decisions and suing Russia for the wrongdoings they have been during their aggressive policy against Ukraine. Also, President paid particular attention to the neighboring countries as strategic partners. Actually, we had problems with, but we get in this situation with the United States. But up until today, we have very good bilateral or bipartisan support, and Ukraine continued to receive military assistance, to receive political assistance, despite of all the turbulences. We hope that after the elections, we could relaunch our bilateral ties with the United States. So as well with the neighboring countries, with the EU, it's also dialogue continued, and all the key priorities that have been established and they continued, the European and the Euro-Atlantic dimension remain key priority. With other partners, there were a couple of visits, I wouldn't dwell on them, but Poland, Turkey, Azerbaijan, other countries, they were among the top priorities. Now we are concentrating ourselves on settlement contradictions with the Hungarian side, with aim to unblock our cooperation with NATO on separate specific spheres. So a number of issues, but what I should say in summary, that the wish for peace, which President Zelensky declared as one of his main priorities, costs. And it's political costs, there are costs in emotional dimension, and you know that it needs more efforts, and not only to cry on each other and to criticize each other, but also to complementary work with each other, and to find the positive critics is very good, because it helps to coordinate efforts and to do maybe best thing in the activity of the authorities. But from the other things, we need to join our society on the issue of on the platform of defending Ukraine, on relaunching things with regard to the settlement of conflict with Russia, and also on the deoccupation of Crimea. It's the key priorities which could be continued as well during the next year. So thank you. I will stop on that, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have.
That's great. Thank you very much for presenting the complex picture so comprehensively in a short period of time, and raising many interesting questions as well, which I will invite now Aliona Hetmanchuk, as I've mentioned, Director of the New Europe Center in Ukraine, to take up any of the issues. And especially we've already had an interesting question from Robert Cooper, focusing especially on the American dimension, which has been mentioned already being a big challenge. And from that point of view, the question is, President Zelensky was elected to deal with corruption, and yet the first thing that happens is that the President of the United States tried to corrupt him. Could you perhaps provide some light somewhere in your presentation on the Ukrainian perspective on this particular story? The floor is yours, Alyona.
Thank you, Katerina. Good evening from rainy Kyiv. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be part of this discussion tonight. Before I comment on the US story and impeachment story, I would like to focus on the question, where is Ukraine foreign policy made? So the short answer to this question is that Ukraine's foreign policy is predominantly made at presidential office with, and it's important, participation of foreign minister. Nothing actually new and nothing actually extraordinary. I think Ambassador Yeliseyev can confirm it. That happened many times before in Ukraine and is happening in other countries when MFA is rather assisting than leading the policy-making process. The long answer is that President Zelensky's foreign policy is mainly a mixture of his own and his close associates' personal beliefs, Ukrainian public orientation, contribution from diplomats, and last but not the least, positions of important international stakeholders. I would elaborate on each of these elements. For the President Zelensky, foreign policy is definitely not as important as for his predecessor. Foreign policy for him, as I see it as an outsider, as a think tanker, foreign policy for him is solely a tool to deliver on his major electoral promises, to end the war in Donbas, to slay corruption, to improve economic situation. I have a feeling that sometimes we talk more about Zelensky foreign policy than he himself talks and thinks about it. And we don't know much about Zelensky's personal beliefs, about his personal vision of the world and international relations. But there are some reasons to presume that some of his beliefs were reflected in his movies and stand-up shows, like the idea that global powers should not indicate Ukraine what to do, or skepticism toward IMF, or Zelensky's notable belief that no one can be trusted because no one really needs Ukraine and we are not really welcome anywhere. The belief which was only reinforced by conversations with certain Western leaders. During his presidency, his first year of the presidency, there are also have been signs of Zelensky's skeptical attitude to diplomacy and diplomats in general. My understanding is that for him, the key to successful foreign policy is the management of personal relationship with other international leaders. Also, it is quite clear that President prefers bilateral relationship instead of multilateral formats. What is quite fascinating is that Zelensky's attitudes are mainly overlapping with the views of Ukrainian general public. And now I'm moving to the second point of Ukraine's foreign policy composition. We don't know who influenced whom and who in fact is imposing foreign policy agenda. President Zelensky by using his still high popularity, or Ukrainian people whose major expectations toward the world are simply embraced and reflected by the president. But the fact is that the most of the ideas Zelensky is promoting are welcomed in the Ukrainian society. I'm talking here about an idea for Ukraine to play more independent role in international relations, to be a subject, not an object, not to be subordinated or externally governed, as some people say in Ukraine, neither by Russia nor by the EU or the US, and to be basically a full-fledged partner, not just a recipient of financial assistance. Ukrainian president made economic diplomacy the core of his foreign policy. I am a little bit surprised that Vasyl didn't mention or didn't elaborate on that, because what I'm hearing almost every day, it's about economic diplomacy as a major priority for Ukraine's foreign policy. And it is interesting because Ukrainians are also in favor of the idea of so-called economization of foreign policy. Moreover, when New Europe Center, the think tank I'm representing, commissioned an opinion poll by asking Ukrainians what should be Ukraine's foreign policy priority, people named exactly economization of foreign policy as #1 priority, with a focus on finding new markets for Ukraine's companies. So not surprisingly, foreign policy is named as top 5 areas according to recent opinion poll conducted by a ranking group, where Ukrainians consider Zelensky areas where Ukraine named as top 5 areas where Ukrainians consider Zelensky effective as a president, or the most effective as a president. The question still remains if they are really so satisfied with his foreign policy, or it just because his foreign policy looks good compared to Zelensky results in fighting against corruption, establishing the rule of law, de-oligarchization, or ending the war at Donbas. So it is still a question. With regard to diplomats and their contribution to Ukraine's foreign policy design, over the year, we have been witnessing a competition, or a sort of competition between traditional and unconventional diplomacy in Ukraine. Despite the propensity of Zelensky and his chief of staff Yermak to challenge well-established diplomatic rules, tools, and even protocols, which sometimes can be useful. It looks like career diplomats and traditional diplomacy is regaining its position now in Ukraine, especially on the dimensions which are not covered by Mr. Yermak himself. And since Mr. Yermak is very busy at the moment managing Donbas peace talks, there remains a lot of room for diplomats on other dimensions. I intentionally mentioned international partners' role in shaping Ukraine's foreign policy in the very end, because in my humble opinion, the role of international partners under Zelensky has decreased. They are not anymore considered the major reform drivers, along with Ukrainian civil society, neither by president nor by society. Only 12% of Ukrainians think that Western countries should be the major reform drivers in Ukraine, compared to 25% just a couple of years ago. So despite being able to be an active and grateful listener, the current president, unlike some of his predecessors, clearly prefers listening to the positions and the reactions inside Ukraine, rather than the advice of partners outside Ukraine. In the same time, talks about Ukraine's assertiveness in international relations are good for political sports or political movies, but reality always makes important corrections. It turned out that President Zelensky can't simply ignore, for example, IMF requirements due to Ukraine's poor economic stance. He cannot ignore the fact that it doesn't matter how vocal Ukraine would be on its intentions to enter the EU and NATO, since neither in the EU nor in NATO, Ukraine is not seen as a potential member in a foreseeable future. He also can't ignore the fact that the more advanced he would be in his talks with Putin on Donbas, the more silent he would become on Ukraine's desire to join the EU and NATO. That's the reality in which Ukraine has to operate. But, and Ukrainian foreign policy has to operate. But I'm pretty sure that Ukraine had already chosen its model for development, and it is European model, regardless of membership perspective in the EU. And now just a couple of comments on the US. So I agree that that was really an unprecedented challenge, and nobody was really ready to deal with it, including President Zelensky. It even looked at some point as a diplomatic disaster. And I have to admit that even now, bilateral agenda, US-Ukraine bilateral agenda is still being trapped by this impeachment saga. Also, I have to say that the perception of the US among Ukrainian decision makers and opinion leaders has deteriorated. The US stance as major reform driver has been also undermined by those demands from the White House to conduct certain investigation. There is a feeling that no progress is possible in our relationship until the US election. And you know, that's quite an unfortunate development, because I think that President Zelensky probably is the most appropriate partner for Trump, President Trump, because on many issues, Zelensky approaches and positions and attitudes resemble Trump's position more than any other world leader. I mean, his skepticism of traditional diplomacy, economic, like a business dimension of foreign relations, bilateral over multilateral relation, preference bilateral over multilateral relationships, and some other like attitudes. And my major concern here is that the story with impeachment and Ukraine, so-called Ukraine Gate, and Ukraine's meddling in 2016 US elections and Biden's story is not over, unfortunately. And there is still a risk that Ukraine would be used in the US campaign. And there are already some signs, some recent signs of that, like yesterday's presentation of so-called call recordings between Vice President Biden and President Poroshenko, which were displayed by MP, pro-Russian, which is important here to mention, pro-Russian member of Ukrainian parliament. So unfortunately, the story is not over.
Right. Great. Thank you very much, Aliona, for this sweeping and very sort of insightful discussion of Ukraine's foreign policy, and highlighting certain paradoxes which emerge. In a way, this inverse situation, there were fairly high expectations on the domestic front and fairly sort of limited expectations in terms of foreign policy, whereas actually now we have relative satisfaction that there have been no disasters, and foreign policy seems to perhaps slightly better than the domestic front. And also it's very interesting what you said, whom can we compare Mr. Zelensky to, and the departure from the early discussion of his comparison to Macron. And now, paradoxically, France being also seen as one of the low points on when scanning the horizon, basically, or situation in Europe. And the issue of coherence, who makes Ukraine's foreign policy, and the existence of the dual tracks, formal and informal tracks. And in that context, James Scher asked a question in terms of continuity and change, given that Russia's policy has not changed over the last 6 years or even longer. To what extent was it realistic to expect change in Ukraine's policy? So this is the question of continuity and change and coherence. And that's sort of a lot to address to our final speaker, Mr. Konstantin Yelisseyev, the former ambassador to the EU and the former deputy head of the presidential administration in Ukraine. So Konstantin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, dear Madam Chair, dear speakers, dear friends, dear participants. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to participate in this great and timely event. As a practitioner for almost 30 years in diplomatic experience, I would like to share my professional assessment of the results of the first year of Zelensky presidency in the fields of foreign policy. First, some background references which can be useful for general understanding of the problem. In accordance with the Ukrainian constitution, the foreign policy is one of the key fields of responsibility of the president. He represents the state in the international relations, governs the foreign policy activities, as well as protects independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the country. Moreover, thanks to the amendments to the constitution made 2 years ago, the president is a guarantor of the implementation of the strategic course of Ukraine towards the EU and NATO membership. So, in order to better understand, let me name some unique starting positions thanks to the solid legacy of his predecessor, such as number one, stable financial situation and growing economy despite Russian aggression and occupation of Ukrainian territory, part of Ukrainian territory. Secondly, good credit history of cooperation with IMF. Let me remind that we had very fruitful cooperation with the IMF during 2014-2019. Strong, efficient, and modern Ukrainian army. Then number four, ambitious and solid agenda of relations with the EU, NATO, and G7 countries. And of course, the ever strongest and unwavering pro-Ukrainian international coalition. As a result, we got effective international sanction mechanisms against aggressor country, against the Russian Federation. And another, in my view, good starting position was for the President Zelensky, good groundbreaking historical decision on establishment of independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which strengthened a spiritual ground for international activity. So I will try to analyze the foreign policy of President Zelensky just in as, again, I would like to underline in a professional but in a frank manner. I would like to start with general description of the key challenges of President Zelensky as a chief diplomat in his first year. Firstly, foreign policy was for President Zelensky a completely new experience. He was new for the foreign policy, as well as foreign policy was a new topic for him. Secondly, very high expectations of Ukrainian society following his electoral promises. For example, to stop quickly the war, even it was a deadline almost half a year, to return back Donbas, Crimea, to engage 40 billion of foreign investment, etc., etc., etc. Secondly, quite naive and simple understanding of the mechanics of the foreign policy and communication with the foreign leaders. Thirdly, lack of clear foreign policy strategy and lack of clear understanding of geopolitical situation in which Ukraine occurred. For example, still he does not understand that the real goal of Russia is to get Ukraine back to the Soviet Union. The real goal of Russia is to create second edition of the Soviet Union. That's why he needs to be serious about Russia. And it's not enough only to see in the eyes of Putin and all problems will be settled, as President used to believe. Fourth issue, this is lack, and by the way, as a result of this lack of clear foreign policy strategy, over the last 12 months, he demonstrated lack of clear-cut strategy on Donbas as well as on Crimea, unfortunately. Number 4, lack of one voice policy of Zelensky's team. And as if you analyze, there were too many speakers who used to speak about foreign policy, starting from members of his parliamentary fraction to some assistants, advisors, and so on and so forth. And number 5, poor management of diplomatic service. Let me remind you that President Zelensky had 3 foreign ministers. He had, especially during the first 6 months, huge distrust vis-a-vis professional diplomats. Even there was a unfortunate event when President Zelensky publicly accused a former foreign minister Klimkin in sabotage and so on and so forth. Of course, this is maybe due to lack of professionalism, due to lack of experience, but it happened, unfortunately. So it is obvious that these challenges affected the foreign policy developments on key priorities issues. And of course, issue number 1, which was already stated today, this is to bring back peace to Ukraine. And this is true, it was a priority number 1 of President Zelensky as well. However, instead of bringing back peace, instead of really to contribute to the establishment of the long-lasting and comprehensive ceasefire, unfortunately, we don't see clear-cut results. And more, I would like to tell you, Zelensky was led directly into Russian trap. Firstly, he had the naive opinion that it's enough, as I mentioned, to see Putin, to hold Normandy summit, and conflict in Ukraine will be settled. But he was wrong. Secondly, as I already underlined, President Zelensky did not have a clear-cut strategy as regards Donbas. As a result, during the last 12 months, we had some chaotic, some different steps in Donbas track. As a result, over 12 months, we see a gradual evolution from the security first principle to Russian scenario where political part of Minsk agreement should be implemented mainly by Ukraine. And the critical moment was when President Zelensky agreed to the Russian imposed version of the well-known Steinmeier formula on local elections in Donbas. Then instead of trying to press on Putin using all leverages, using sanctions, using our partners to establish comprehensive ceasefire in Donbas, he agreed on the Russian proposal of disengagement of forces along the touch line. It meant retreat of Ukrainian armed forces from the previous position and so on and so forth. And thirdly, he did not understand clearly the role of the idea of possible deployment of UN peacekeepers in occupied Donbas, including the uncontrolled part of the Ukrainian-Russian border. Of course, we can discuss more thoroughly during our today's discussion of this issue, but what is also very unfortunate that over the last 12 months, we witnessed the erosion of the principle established since the year 2014, which means nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Unfortunately, we see this quite clearly, this erosion. Of course, to be objectively, the only step forward in Donbas track, which we can underline, it was the exchange of prisoners and hostages. But of course, unfortunately, this story shows that it has transformed into never-ending process and with some problems. Let me remind you the release of figure of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the key person in tragedy of the MH17, or the issue that as a result of this exchange, President Zelensky released some criminals which had nothing to do with the situation in Donbas and so on and so forth. So to sum up, 1 year later, the promise of quick peace lies in ruins, and the process of international rehabilitation of Putin has been encouraged by the efforts, unfortunately, of Zelensky team. Unfortunately, we didn't see quite big progress in the process of the occupation of Crimea as well. This issue also we can discuss later today. Second track, it was, of course, American track, and you are right, just after the famous phone conversation of President Zelensky with President Trump and famous quid pro quo issue, the US bipartisan support is hanging on the straw. The US pro-Ukrainian team is almost erased. Let me remind you just resignation of a famous diplomat, Kurt Volker, who helped us a lot, namely in Normandy process. Unfortunately, the bilateral relations are in fact in the post-regime. Ukraine became toxic, and unfortunately, no big multi-million economic project were launched over the last 12 months. Unfortunately, javelins as a symbol of defense cooperation between Ukraine and NATO still remain the symbol. No other, movement in this cooperation. Third area of foreign policy of President Zelensky was the EU and NATO integration. Of course, about EU, more or less, we can tell that it's okay. But in terms of NATO, we see that the cooperation of Ukraine with NATO now put on pause. As a vivid example, for example, you don't see in President's rhetoric the issue of membership action plan. You don't see in President's rhetoric the issue of integration of Ukraine to NATO. You then see, so this is very unfortunate, and maybe he is doing so in order not to irritate Putin, but in my view, this is not the right way to move forward towards implementation of the Constitution's provisions. Of course, fourth track of President Zelensky diplomacy was bilateral track, bilateral relations. Vasil already mentioned mainly the bilateral relations with neighboring countries. Yes, with Poland, with Hungary, with Turkey, Georgia, Belarus. As I see here, President Zelensky followed the line of continuity, and which is good. The only problem since 2019, I see still we have with Hungary. Unfortunately, Hungary is still blocking Ukraine-NATO cooperation, and I don't see light at the end of the tunnel on this track. And the fifth direction of the foreign policy of Zelensky over the last 12 months was, of course, the so-called force majeure diplomacy. This is, of course, related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, the tragedy dealing with the downing of Ukrainian airplane in Iran. And of course, if we talk about COVID-19's diplomacy, President's response were rather chaotic, emotional, and consistent. This is mainly concerning internal challenges. But in terms of external challenges here, Ukraine made some important steps. Namely, let me remind you that Ukraine sent Ukrainian doctors to Italy to help to fight against this pandemic, this virus. And secondly, let me remind you that Ukrainian authorities, using also Ukrainian aircrafts, evacuated a lot of foreigners from foreign countries. And as optimist by nature, just to end my remarks, I would like to sum up with some brighter remarks. Firstly, I would like to see and believe it could be true that President Zelensky will draw lessons from the mistakes of the first year and will become a responsible, strategic leader of the nation who strives not for the show, but for the long-lasting success. I see this trend is becoming more and more positive starting from the recent appointment of the new foreign minister, ambassador, as well as, by the way, gradual increasing of the role of the foreign ministry in implementation of key foreign policy priorities, because beforehand, Ukrainian foreign ministry did not participate proactively in Donbas track, on US track. Now it's not the case. And of course, what is very important, President Zelensky is very sensitive to the position of civil society, which is very good. And he demonstrated it on the example of his participation in Normandy summit in Paris in December last year. So the red lines which were drawn by Ukrainian civil society were kept by President Zelensky, and he did not overcome them. And what is important? Number one, to manage expectations. Number two, to rely on professionals. And number three, to be more strategic on Crimea, on Donbas. And please do not forget about creeping annexation by Russia of Azov Sea and Kerch Strait. This is, by the way, the issue which unfortunately was out of foreign policy of Zelensky. And last but not least, let me make some positive remarks about using by Ukraine international courts in order to protect Ukrainian interests and to bring Russia to the responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Konstantin, for such a sweeping and presentation and the sobering assessment of the current administration, but also for your finishing on the positive note. But nevertheless, your presentation offered a kind of reality check, and it's interesting that you actually assess that, you know, the presidential administration has not, or the in foreign policy, the Ukrainian leaders have not delivered clear-cut results on the Donbas, but arguably, given sort of the lack of experience and policy, especially understanding vis-a-vis Russia, perhaps not achieving current results is a better outcome than achieving disastrous results, as many feared. So I'm sort of a bit recalibrating, and this is a round table, and we have three complementary perspectives. So I would very much encourage the speakers to respond to each other points and take issues. And yet we would also would like to open the floor to the participants. We would like you to raise your hand, which basically when you go to the participants list, open the participants list, your name will be at the top and you can click the blue hand, which indicates there is a question, that you would like to raise a question. Could I also ask if you want to ask a question, please show yourself to make sure that we know that you are still there in person to ask the question. So we are looking for the hands raised, but we have actually, in light of perhaps the sort of triggering the discussion, and I would like to ask Vasyl Bodnar perhaps to relate to one of the points which Konstantin mentioned with regard to Donbas, the issue of what is Ukraine's current strategy on the proposed UN peacekeeping forces? If you could perhaps update us on this, if possible, please.
So the main idea of today's foreign policy of President Zelensky was to bring peace, and it was mentioned by all our speakers, but the idea was to use existing mechanisms up until it will show that these mechanisms are not effective anymore. So up until today, not all resources have been used, and the different opportunities are being installed with the new persons, with the new ideas, and it's still continuing. But the issue with the peacekeepers are in the plan B or plan C. It depends on the way how the track will develop. So actually it depends mostly on the foreign policy of Russia. And Russia has shown anything positive, any positive attitude towards the peace settlement. So they continue to wage war, they continue to send materials, and all we need to continue pressure and to use all political means to end the war. But if this Minsk track and Normandy format will not bring to the results, the issue of plan B or plan C will be used, and we'll turn back to the idea already been elaborated and worked out with our partners from Germany and France, which actually agreed the plan of bringing peacekeepers to Donbas. But we need the agreement of the Russian side, because they are the occupant power, who is occupying Ukrainian territory, and that is the only military operation which will lead to the bringing peacekeepers later on. But it's not the way. We are settled to settle the conflict on the peaceful and diplomatic way. So with the other reflection, I wouldn't like to take the time on discussing all the theses have been said, but in general terms, I'm in the diplomatic service for 22 years. It's every time for the diplomacy in Ukraine, the key issue, who is the main, Office of the President or Ministry of Foreign Affairs? I will assure you that ministry participates in every point to develop, except maybe some specifics on the Russian track, which is being done by the head of the Office of the President. But we are working out and delivering all the necessary messages to the President and participating in all the endeavors which are related to the foreign policy. And we are the institution which actually execute it. So actually, it depends on what the track is being chosen, but every president has its own priorities. The President Zelenskyy chooses the peace, and he's doing how it's called. Actually, it was also the very good year to get the lesson and to understand the complex history of foreign policy in general terms. But it also leads to the conclusions, what we can, what we cannot, and how to change or update our foreign policy priorities. And I didn't forget about any other things which we could do about the economic developments, about the public diplomacy, about the priorities to defend our citizens abroad. But it's like a strategy inside the main dimension with which to defend ourselves. We could also talk about the positive story for Ukraine, because defending ourselves, we should also reform ourselves and present ourselves to the world as the country which developed democracy in the time of war. It is also one of the achievements we have been preserving. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is we have now some questions from the floor. So I would like to invite Duncan Allen to pose his question or comments.
Thank you. Duncan Allen, Russia-Eurasia Programme, Chatham House. First of all, thank you very much indeed to our three speakers for their excellent presentations. I have a specific question which really has to do with Ukrainian perceptions. What, in the opinion of our speakers, was the significance of the replacement earlier this year on the Russian side of Surkov by Kozak as the senior official responsible for oversight of the war in the Donbas? And what, if any, impact has Kozak had on bilateral exchanges with the Ukrainian side? Thank you.
Who is this question to? Any of the three speakers? So
any of the three, yeah.
If I may, it might be seen as the symbol that the Russians are also looking for some solutions, and they're changing people and may further on change the tactics. But it also shows that we should be consistent in our policy towards continuing sanctions, continuing keeping these red lines with regard to the existing Russia-Ukrainian conflict, but not with the internal conflict. And one of the red lines is also what Russia is trying to push for, direct communication with Donetsk and Luhansk. It is also impossible because this is the Russian Muppets. So on our side is truth, and it is shown that we could continue with this dimension for the peaceful resolution of the conflict.
thank you very much. Alyona would like to?
Just like a short remark. I would not overestimate this appointment, Kozak's appointment instead of Surkov. I would rather consider it as a Russian attempt to present this appointment as a sort of concession or a compromising step to show that Russia is moving, is also making some steps forward, which is not true. And as far as I know, Russian diplomats and representatives, they position this step as their concession. So, and that's not true. Also, as a person who followed Moldova and Transnistria issue, I would say that Kozak played not very constructive role there, and we know what was behind his ideas there. And as I see now, he's trying to update some of his ideas. Actually, not to upgrade significantly, but to update some of his Transnistrian ideas and to sell them to Ukrainian side, using the fact that Mr. Yermak and some other people who are dealing with Donbas, they are not quite knowledgeable about what was going on Transnistria and other conflict where Mr. Kozak was involved. And my main point here is that Ukraine's strategy and strategy toward Donbas is not defined by Mr. Kozak or Mr. Surko. Ukraine's strategy is personally defined by Mr. Putin. So actually, yeah, there is a question of tactics. It's not question of strategy or any shift in Russian strategy.
Great, thank you very much.
Yes, Katerina, let me just brief remarks. Fully agree with what Alena just said. Strategically, the position of Russians with the replacement of Mr. Surkov to Mr. Kozak did not change, because strategy is defined by one person, you know whom I'm talking about. But in terms of tactics, yes, it means the appointment of Kozak means that Russia decided slightly to switch to the tactics of, I would say, settlement of situation in occupied Donbas. By this decision, they're trying to introduce some experience from Transnistria. And you know that Mr. Kozak is very famous for this experience, and it means that Russia wants to create new Transnistria in Ukraine. So this is what Kozak is trying to do. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Now we'll take the question. We actually have some questions from the chat part of our roundtable, and perhaps the question which the three speakers made to ponder, given the how complex the last year has been against the massive expectations, what is the general feeling in terms of assessment? It's a question from David Heath and Richard Wright. In your view, has Ukraine gained or has it lost on the international arena? Has its Ukraine standing improved, or has it been somehow weakened internationally? What are your views on this? Anybody who would like to tackle this particular question?
So it is not a simple question, because we know how the countries are dwelling attention to their own interests and how many cases happened during that period of time, taking, for example, the case of Russia turning back to Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. Taking into consideration the policy of France with regards to the re-establishment of contacts with Russia. But basically, Ukraine preserved its stance with regard to the sanction policy, which is the main tool of influence on the Russian side. The other thing that these over expectations from the international community that Mr. Zelensky, or President Zelensky, will give up everything and will go to Russia also doesn't exist. So they understand that the president defends the sovereignty of its country, and the interests of Ukraine domain. That's the main thing which maybe dwell on this attention, and not to take your time more. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
If I may just quickly, just from my humble opinion, because Vasily is an official, so for him, he is a diplomat, he wants to protect his position. Look, my answer is the following. Because of a very huge and solid legacy, which President Zelensky got from his predecessor, still Ukraine is surviving and Ukraine is struggling, which is true. Yes, there are, as I mentioned, some erosions in terms of strong pro-Ukrainian coalition, in terms of some key negotiating principles, in terms of settlement of the situation in Donbas. But I would be more, I would like to tell you, look, dear friends, if Ukraine fails, if Ukrainian foreign policy fails, it would be failure for the all European countries, because we could not ignore Ukraine as one of the biggest European countries. That's why my plea and my appeal, this is to our European partners. Please keep in mind, please help us. Again, if Ukraine sinks, everybody will sink. So in Europe. So please be serious and please continue to render to Ukraine supports, for example, in terms of prolongation of sanctions, even strengthening. Please do not keep silence. Please continue to express solidarity and unity with Ukraine. This is key. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we are moving on to the next question, and this time I would like to invite Katerina Busol to pose her question or comment.
Thank you very much. And I've got two questions to Mr. Vasyl Bodnar. You mentioned the International Criminal Court and the willingness of the government to see the court opening the investigation into the situation in Ukraine. But it seems that the International Criminal Court is actually the example when the policy and the practice and the law in Ukraine do not really marry, because although Ukraine struggles for the investigation of the court, it does not ratify the statute of the court, although it is obliged to do so under the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. So how would you comment on that? What's the rationale behind this postponement in the ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court? And the second question is about the strategy behind the international proceedings of Ukraine as such. So there's been much criticism that different proceedings in different courts are regulated by different authorities. So the Scythian Gold case is dealt with by the Ministry of Justice, the ICJ case is dealt more by the MFA, and the prosecutor's offices deal more with the ICC. So do you think we need a body, an authority, or perhaps it is there and there's just not enough of communication that has more of the umbrella thinking behind all of these proceedings? Thank you.
Thank you. So who would like to tackle Mr.
So if I may reply. So as you know, that we allowed the ICC to have an investigation from the 2014, but now the issue of ratification is within the competence of the Ukrainian parliament. So it is in process, and hopefully there will be a decision after all the reforms, not to be fulfilled, but when the time will come. So we will raise the issue as well. Maybe I a little bit slapped my tongue on the International Court of Justice, except the criminal court, but which was also one of the cases which could be in the track. So with regard to the coordination, we have specific working group which is coordinating efforts with regard to the common claims against Russian aggression policy and what all the cases coordinated by a group, not a single body. Because if to coordinate, to create a specific ministry or agency, and then to combine all the claims, to whom to apply? Because it's a different responsibilities and a different attempt. If you may be aware very good about these cases with regard to the rights of Crimean Tatars and with regard to the terrorism sponsorship. It all has specific judicial responsibilities, and in case we will fail to do as, sorry, but Georgians managed to do in 2008, so we will not win any cases and the procedures will not take place. So that is necessary to have this division now in tactics, but general in strategy. If it satisfied my answer, I don't know.
Thank you. Would any of the speakers like to complement that answer, or can we move on? Yep, let's move on. Now we have the question from Andriy Shevchenko. Could we unmute Andriy Shevchenko, and could you please introduce yourself as well?
Thank you. I'm the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, and my name is Andriy Shevchenko. And I have a question for Konstantin Yeliseyev, and you'll understand why. I think for the purpose of a good exercise, we would like, at least for a minute, to focus on the new things that President Zelensky has brought into the Ukrainian foreign policy. So, Konstantin, how would you use President Zelensky's style? How would you use his priorities? How we could use his ways of doing things domestically and internationally? Do you see any new opportunities for President Zelensky that you, for different reasons, did not have with President Poroshenko? And maybe Alena has something to say on that as well.
Thank you. So we'll start with Konstantin now.
First of all, thank you very much, Andriy, and I'm very happy to see you. Once again, a very good question. Number one, look, President Zelensky, what is good? He is a very good person who can really quickly learn lessons. This is his good point, and that's why at the end of my remarks I express a positive opinion that because he's a quick learner, he can of course understand some problems, some mistakes, and maybe will not repeat them again. Number two, he is very sensitive, and which is good, very sensitive to the public opinion. And this is also very good because, you know, public society in Ukraine very vigilant, very firm, and here I see that as a guarantee that we will not treason Ukrainian national interest. And the third point, this is, of course, he can speak, he can make shows. But he must understand that sometimes more shows it's not good, and sometimes he needs to understand that better something to do and then to publicize rather than firstly to publicize and then trying to do. So this is another issue. And last but not least, I see now he is becoming more positive vis-a-vis foreign ministry, and what is very important, he still he understands better that more he needs to rely not on the person who likes him very much, more he needs to rely to the person who can bring to Ukraine more dividends, who can bring to Ukraine more useful things. This is very important. And of course, last but not least, he can quickly and very easily establish bilateral contacts. And here in a bilateral communication with the leaders, these characteristics he can use in a proper manner, in a positive spirit. For example, in my view, he can use these positive characteristics in his dialogue with President Macron, for example, in order to promote EU and NATO integration, which is good. So all these points are positive, and in my view, if he will take into account all these things, maybe in 12 months we can applaud to his foreign policy. Thank you.
Alena?
Thank you, Andriy, for your question, and it was good to see you. online. I have like a specific answer for this question, because since the beginning of Zelensky presidency, I'm quite convinced that with his presidency, there is a room for Ukraine to increase its soft power in the Russian-speaking world and in some post-Soviet countries, where Zelensky was popular or was perceived as celebrity even before becoming a president. And now we are actually, at our think tank, we are preparing a study on Ukraine's soft power in 5 post-Soviet states. And even at this stage, I can say that Zelensky phenomena and Zelensky popularity brings some added value to Ukraine's image and Ukraine's position in these states. And I think it would be very smart and very good to use Zelensky presidency in order to increase Ukraine's positioning in Russian-speaking world in some post-Soviet states and among some Russian-speaking even in people in the Western European state, in the US and maybe even Canada, I don't know. So that's like a little bit different point, but also could be a part of the answer to your question.
Great, thank you very much. Anybody else who would like to chip in on this particular question? No? Okay, so we are ready to move on. And now we have a question from Robert Brinkley, the former UK ambassador to Ukraine. And the question is going back to the Donbas portfolio, if I can put it this way. And his question is about the proposal. What happened to the proposal for a consultative council, including the representatives of the Donetsk and Luhansk, which was signed by Andriy Yermak? Was it a mistake, or is President Zelensky going to relaunch it? Could you please provide answers? Aliona, we can start with you.
Yeah, I will start, and I'm sure that Vasil and Konstantin will have something to add. Actually, as far as I understand, the idea of consultative council is not relevant anymore. So because there was an upgrading of Ukrainian delegation, and this upgrading of Ukrainian delegation by adding to Ukrainian Minsk delegation some deputy ministers and head of committees from Verkhovna Rada was aimed to substitute the idea of consultative council. So now we are talking, we are not talking about consultative council anymore. We are talking about upgrading Ukrainian delegation to Minsk negotiations. And that is a clear evidence, another clear evidence that Ukrainian president and his team and his main negotiator, who is Mr. Yermak, they're quite vulnerable to public reaction, to civil society reaction, what actually Mr. Yeltseyev mentioned before. And now we have a chance to move with without consultative council, but with upgrading the Ukrainian delegation. And that's also a clear evidence that, I mean, upgrading of our delegation and negotiation team, that is a clear evidence that Ukraine is serious about making a progress in peace talks, that Ukraine is finding new solution, that Ukraine is proactive. And by doing this Ukraine actually, and Ukrainian president actually demonstrate that the problem is not in Kyiv. the problem is not lack of political will in Kyiv. The problem is in Kremlin. So I think these steps should be interpreted and should be taken in this way.
Thank you.
If I may, just very quickly, I would like to tell you that I was among the persons who criticized this move to create so-called consultative council, because the main aim was to establish direct dialogue with the pro-Russian puppets. That is why it's not appropriate. Secondly, it's not appropriate in the manner it was done, without any consultation with the Ukrainian society, with Ukrainian people. And thirdly, it was again an example of another one chaotic and not very clearly understand a clear step towards creating the vision of kind of smoke screen of settlement in Donbas. Unfortunately, all these steps, as well as upgrading the level of Ukrainian delegation trilateral contact group in Minsk, this is just only cosmetic steps. This is just to distract or divert the attention from the key issue. We need to talk about issue of the number one, establishing comprehensive and complete ceasefire in Donbas. Russia must stop kill Ukrainians. Only then we can talk about something else. But all these things, now Russia included idea, let's talk about terms of reference of the activity of the trilateral contact group. This is all about bureaucracy. So this is Russia would like to create the vision of positive attitude, vision of cooperation, in order just to create again small screen of the constructive approach towards Russia. At the same time, we are forgetting about ceasefire, we are forgetting about border. Don't forget that Russia still continue to supply weaponry, ammunition, soldiers, and so on to the Ukrainian territory. So that is why my point here, we need to concentrate on key security issues. Thank you.
If I may, just a couple of words. So, as I understand...
Could I just ask, chip in a question? Given what the previous speaker said, could you just perhaps elaborate to what extent within basically the, insofar as the presidential administration is concerned, this issue, is Donbas now perceived as a long game, and is it accepted? And if yes, what does it mean for electoral chances? As we've mentioned, President Zelenskyy is very aware of his rating, and it does matter. And if foreign policy is so important, not resolving Donbas quickly, even by making compromises, what does it mean? To what extent Donbas is perceived as a short-term or longer-term issue for Ukraine? Thank you.
If I may. So it's purely understandable that Donbas issue, or conflict, Russian-Ukrainian military conflict, it's a long history. So why we are fighting for attention of international community and attracting more and more attention on the different platforms? It's because of Russia would like to create another zone of unfrozen conflict and try to use this conflict zone as the tool of influence on Ukraine. So that's why it's, from my point of view, it's understandable that it's a long game. And from the perspective of elections, it's also understandable that in one period, it's not so easy to finalize all the problems with Russians and to stop bloodshed. Mr. Ambassador Yeliseyev correctly said that the main story is to stop bloodshed and to stop shelling. And we all apply to all international community members, press on Russia, because otherwise we should defend ourselves militarily. And that's the only way to stop the shellings from the other side. But in general terms, we understand that we need to concentrate more on looking for the ways how to continue with the settlement, how to use normative format, and how to use how our partners should be engaged in pressing on Russia to to stop sending military equipment, etc., and support the occupational authorities. From the other point of view, there is also looking for the new opportunities within the territorial contact group. With this council, or how it's called, it was not the attempt to establish direct contact. It's the red line for the President Zelenskyy administration, and the administration will never go to the direct communication with Donbas and Luhansk, because it's the Russian puppet. It's fully understandable. And the recent developments with the so-called representatives of these occupied territories to territorial contact group shows that it is purely Russian citizens. So, which gives an additional proof that our position is very correct. But it was some kind of, let's not forget about the other attempt to create a working group on control of border, which is also have been under discussion, and it is still under the question how we could proceed on that. So it is not only the one topic which have been attracting more public attention about the settlement of the conflict, but we are not forgetting about also the security dimension. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So can I just remind everybody that to raise hand, the best way is to go to the participants section. You click on the participants section at the bottom. If you cannot see it, click on more, and the participants button appears. And then when you usually on the right hand side, you can see the sort of menu, and then you can raise hand. It's a blue button, the very first one. So now we have the next question is from Domitila Gramoso. I think I pronounced it correctly. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Katerina. It was excellent. And thank you very much for all the speakers. It's fascinating. I have a question which may sound a bit provocative, but it really results from my own conversations with experts in Moscow about the problems in Ukraine and how we can find a way forward. Every time we discuss ways of sort of deconflicting and resolving this entire conflict from Donbas to Crimea, and the conversations are pretty heated, so I don't want to appear as if I'm taking the other side, but they often refer to problems which to me seemed a bit sort of already sort of resolved, but they're obviously not. And this is the question of language, the question of the evaluation of certain figures that participated in the Second World War. And again, this idea that the Ukraine of today is a Ukraine that would not be sort of welcoming to Russian speakers or to Russian citizens, or sort of that they would feel in some way that they are not really, they are being forced to sort of Ukrainize. And I'm not saying I agree with this position, but I wonder if this is an area where there is maybe some room of maneuver, which doesn't necessarily imply a sort of handing in of sovereignty, or if this is seen as any change in the sort of language laws or the perceptions about actors during the historical periods of Ukraine. Is that perceived as something that any changes in that area would be seen as handing in to Russia? Or is this an area where maybe something can be done, as Alyona mentioned, in the sort of soft power dimension? Because I think it would be so useful to have sort of the Russian people sort of feel that there is an opening towards people there as well. I mean, this is the perception that I get from Moscow. I'm not saying necessarily that I share it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question now moving to perhaps identity politics, language, and this is a different dimension which we haven't covered yet. So let's start with Konstantin, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Very good question and very interesting. Unfortunately, it would take for me hours and hours to explain the whole situation, but I will try to be very brief. First, I would like to tell to distinguished colleague that the real aim of Russia is not Donbas, is not a language. The real aim of Russia is to put back Ukraine to the new Soviet Union. The real aim of Russia to create new Soviet Union. And in this geopolitical game, Ukraine is a big fish for Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia could not create new Soviet Union empire. And you know, this is the key goal and dream of President Putin. That's why Russia could use any kind of pretext, language, faces, other problems in order just to increase influence, church, by the way, in order to increase influence on Ukraine. So you need to understand this, number one. Number two, this is Russia who decided to invade Ukraine. This is Russia who is killing Ukrainians. This is Russia who is trying to use hybrid threats in order to bring back Ukraine to the Russian spheres of interest. But the only sin of Ukraine is to try to be independent, to go towards European and Euro-Atlantic integration. This is the only sin. And for that, Russia is trying to punish us. That is why, in this regard, we count very much on the support of our Western partners. So until there is a Russian aggression in Ukraine, we cannot talk about prosperous, safe, secure Europe. So the quicker we settle the situation with Russia, the quicker we bring back peace to Ukraine, the better would be for everybody. And by the way, while talking about Donbas, please do not underestimate and do not ignore Crimea. And last but not least, I would like to underline one interesting topic. In Ukraine, we have more than 100 different ethnic minorities, 100. And we don't have any other conflict with them. I am Russian-born, Russian-speaking person. So I was born in Donbas. So that is why I always was in favor of Russia. But as soon as Russia is trying to behave as an aggressor country, as a crocodile who would like to eat another country, so this is unacceptable. Thank you.
Right. Any other speaker? Could I just, at this stage of our discussion, could I ask you to keep your answer?
Just small remark, 30 seconds, if you may. Dear Domitila, thank you for the question, but generally the idea was that situation in Ukraine. That is not situation in Ukraine, the situation with Russia, because they are the cause. So it's like a stereotype. So we are under the threat of hybrid attacks, and all pretexts are used against us. So it is said that, okay, we are hunting for Russians and Ukrainizing them, or doing something wrong with that. Just the figure, millions of Russians are crossing Ukrainian border. I mean, no problem with that, except those who are fighting against us. That's the simple as that.
Thank you.
And
Alona, would you
just a short remark that talks about some threats to Russian-speaking people. For me, like the only explanation I have that they are using it as an argument to justify a Russian aggression in Ukraine. And the biggest problem here is that, that according to Putin, even if Ukraine has a right to exist as a state, as a sovereign state, it should exist only according to his vision. And his vision is quite a distorted one, and distorted by so-called alternative facts, that is his vision of Ukraine. And that is the biggest problem. So the only place where Russian speakers in Ukraine are threatened and their lives are threatened is the place where Russian troops actually stationed, occupied Donbas and in Crimea.
Great, thank you very much. And now we have just 4 or 5 minutes left. So I'm going to abuse my moderator's position and give the floor to James Sher to pose the very last question or comment, wrapping out our discussion.
Thank you, Kasia. I was very interested earlier in Alyona's assessment of Kazakh's appointment. And I would just like to add to this that Kazakh appears when a settlement appears possible. And I think this is a key factor, but a settlement, of course, on Russia's terms, which have not changed. So my question to you all is, when you sit in Moscow and you see the Macron initiative to bring Moscow into Europe, the first signs of discord about Russia between France and Germany, the baleful position of the Trump administration, which at best is internally conflicted, and Zelensky's apparent steps towards accepting elements of the Russian basis for settlement, what earthly incentive does the Kremlin have to change anything about its approach?
Great. It's good to hear that even on Zoom, James sounds himself. So the final question, to the three speakers from the Russian perspective, how can it be seen? Could please, 1 minute at most, who would like to offer a final comment on this?
I think that James is right here. There is no incentive actually for Putin if he sees and if he is witnessing all of this, steps and actions from our Western partners, including last statements, Trump-Putin statements on 75th anniversary of the meeting at Elbe. And yes, and that's why I think we have two options now. Basically, the first option is to agree on Russian terms and to conduct diplomacy of quick wins, as I see it. But in this way, there could be an internal conflict in Ukraine. There could be a real civil war, not imaginary by Russian propaganda, but a real civil war, civil conflict in Ukraine. So this is the first option. And the second option is to take care of, to make Ukraine more resilient, to reform, to modernize, and to be prepared to another protracted conflict, unfortunately. So this is the two options I see, as a realistic option I see at the moment, unfortunately.
Great, thank you very much. So, Konstantin.
Just number one, thank you very much for this interesting question. Number one, we need to continue to follow the path, the principle, the logic, peace through strength. We need to continue, and the best motivation for Putin would be the strengthening of the international sanctions. By the way, I'm a protagonist of the sanctions, which is more of political nature. Like, for example, why not to provide Ukraine with a membership action plan? In my view, it will be the best sanctions against Russia, because Russia is afraid. NATO, EU, Ukraine is a member of NATO and the European Union. Number three, you need to be more resilient on Nord Stream 2. We need to kill this project. This is could be another motivation for Putin to be, if we can, count on this, but at least to go back from Donbas. And number four, as Alona already mentioned, a strong, prosperous, economically viable Ukraine would be a real nightmare for Putin. So that's why, in order to create a strong, prosperous Ukraine, number one, Ukraine needs to be successful in terms of internal reforms. And number two, of course, with the help, of course, of the international community, and mainly with the help of the European Union. So this is four motivations for Putin to go back from Ukraine. But of course, this is maybe my optimistic scenario, because again, as long as Putin is in Kremlin, as long as there is no 100% consensus among the European Union, for example, in terms of Nord Stream 2, difficult to talk about the incentives for Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Konstantin, at the end of our roundtable, finishes on the most optimistic note. Vasyl, would you like to chip in, or have all the points been covered?
Yes, agree that strong Ukraine, strong European and NATO member is the best response for Russian aggressive policy. But look, I have been working once upon a time in Moscow. I remember how Putin started his career, and he had been promoting the democratic idea of Russia, etc., etc. But at the end, he became once again the next Stalin or Tsar, who would like to expand, who would like to threaten neighbors and conduct aggressive policies. So whatever we would plan, we should be cautioned that we should work together with all our neighbors and with all neighbors of Russia to defend ourselves from the aggressive policy, because it's the core element of Russian foreign policy, unfortunately. And the understanding in Europe of this basic threat should lead to the end of the conflict in Ukraine, because then there will be no separate interest defended by each other countries, and then the understanding will be that the mutual peace in Europe and stability will be only when we join our efforts and stop one aggressor state. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we've used our time and a bit more. Thank you so much for such a sort of comprehensive, rich and informing discussion. You know, we've covered so much ground, and I'm really grateful to our speakers from Ukraine that they've sacrificed their evening because it's much later in Ukraine, but also to the people in the UK who've sacrificed a beautiful evening outside. So it's time to wrap up. And let's express our sort of appreciation virtually, whatever we feel like. So thank you so much, and we'll continue with our roundtables and virtual seminars. Thank you so much.